The thunder of hoofbeats tore through the peaceful afternoon as Katherine Foster struggled against the rough hands that dragged her from the boardwalk into the dusty street of Nogales, Arizona Territory. The year was 1885, and the border town that straddled American soil and Mexican territory was no stranger to violence, but the boldness of this daylight abduction sent onlookers scattering for cover. "Get your hands off me!" Katherine screamed, her honey blonde hair coming loose from its carefully arranged style as she fought against her captors. At 23, she had the spirit of the frontier in her blood, but even her fierce independence was no match for the three armed men who surrounded her. "Quiet, Miss Foster, or we'll make you quiet," growled the tallest of the outlaws, pressing the cold barrel of his revolver against her ribs. His breath reeked of whiskey and tobacco as he leaned close to her ear. "Your daddy's gonna pay mighty fine to get you back in one piece." Katherine's father, Howard Foster, was the wealthiest man in the Arizona Territory, with banking interests that stretched from Nogales to Tucson. She had known since childhood that her family's fortune made her a target, but she had never truly believed anyone would be bold enough to attempt something like this. The outlaws bundled her onto a horse, one man mounting behind her while the other two swung into their saddles. The leader, who had introduced himself with a mocking bow as Jeremiah Cole, tucked his revolver back into his holster with a satisfied grin. "Let's ride, boys. We got a long journey ahead of us." As they thundered out of town, Katherine caught one last glimpse of horrified faces peering from windows and doorways. No one had dared to intervene, and she couldn't blame them. Not against three armed desperados who had clearly planned this abduction with precision. What Katherine couldn't see was the tall figure who emerged from the saloon just moments after the dust from their departure had settled in the street. Quentin Hayes stood at 6 feet 4 inches, his broad shoulders tense beneath the worn leather of his vest, steel blue eyes narrowing as he watched the retreating forms of the kidnappers. Though only 30 years old, Quentin had already earned a reputation as one of the most skilled trackers in the territory, a man who had ridden with the Arizona Rangers before striking out on his own. "They took Katherine Foster," said Sheriff Mills, approaching Quentin with a grim expression. "Howard's already offering $1,000 for her safe return." Quentin didn't respond immediately. His history with the Foster family was complicated. 3 years ago, he had worked as a ranch foreman for Howard Foster until a misunderstanding had led to his dismissal. He had seen Katherine occasionally in town since then, but they had rarely spoken. Still, the thought of her in the hands of men like Jeremiah Cole made his blood run cold. "I'll bring her back," he said finally, his voice low and determined, "but I don't want Foster's money." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "Then why go after them? Cole's gang is dangerous. They've killed before." Quentin's jaw tightened. "Some things aren't about money, Sheriff." Without further explanation, he strode toward the livery where his stallion, a powerful black gelding named Midnight, was stabled. Within 20 minutes, he had gathered his supplies. Ammunition for his Winchester rifle and Colt revolver, provisions for several days, canteen, bedroll, and his tracking tools. As he rode out of Nogales, following the clear trail left by the kidnappers, his mind flashed back to the last real conversation he'd had with Katherine Foster. It had been at the town's Founders' Day dance, almost a year ago. He'd found her alone on the boardwalk outside, staring up at the stars with a wistful expression that had caught him off guard. "Not enjoying the festivities, Miss Foster?" he had asked, keeping a respectful distance. She had turned to him with surprise, her green eyes reflecting the lamplight. "Mr. Hayes, I didn't expect to see you here. Even cowboys need to remember they're civilized occasionally," he'd replied with a small smile. "Is that what you are, just a cowboy?" There had been genuine curiosity in her voice, not the condescension he might have expected from a banker's daughter, among other things. He had stepped closer then, drawn by something in her expression. "What are you doing out here alone, breathing?" she had said simply. "Sometimes I feel like I can't breathe in there. All those expectations, all those eyes watching the banker's daughter." The honesty of her answer had surprised him, and they had talked for nearly an hour after that about books she had read, places he had seen, dreams they both held close. It was the most genuine conversation he'd had with a woman in years. The next time he had seen her in town, she had been accompanied by her father and several of his business associates. She had nodded politely in his direction, but the moment of connection was gone, locked behind the propriety that her position demanded. Now, as Quentin urged midnight into a steady lope, following the clear tracks heading northwest out of town, he pushed away the memory and focused on the task at hand. Katherine Foster needed him, whether she knew it or not, and he would not fail her. The Outlaws pushed hard for the first few hours, clearly wanting to put as much distance between themselves and Nogales as possible. Katherine's wrists were bound in front of her, and she sat stiffly in front of Jeremiah Cole, determined not to lean back against his chest despite the grueling pace. "Where are you taking me?" she demanded when they finally slowed to water the horses at a small creek. Cole yanked her roughly from the saddle, causing her to stumble and fall to her knees in the dirt. "To a place where nobody's gonna find you until your daddy pays up, Miss Foster." "We're asking for $5,000. Think he values you that much? He'll pay," she said coldly, rising to her feet with as much dignity as she could muster. "And then he'll hunt you down like the dogs you are." The youngest of the Outlaws, a scrawny man with yellowed teeth whom Cole called Rattle, laughed nervously. "She's got spirit, don't she? Too much for her own good," said the third man, a bulky, scar-faced outlaw named Becker. He approached Katherine, lifting a strand of her hair with his grimy fingers. "Pretty little thing, though." Katherine jerked away from his touch, her eyes flashing with defiance. "Touch me again and you'll regret it." Cole shoved Becker back. "She's worth nothing to us damaged, remember that." He turned to Katherine. "We'll be reaching our hideout tomorrow. You behave yourself and this will go a lot easier." As they remounted and continued their journey, Katherine fought to keep her fear at bay. She was no helpless damsel growing up on the frontier, had taught her resilience and resourcefulness. Her father had insisted she learn to ride and shoot, skills that had scandalized her mother's Eastern relatives, but which might serve her well now. All she needed was one opportunity, one moment of carelessness from her captors. What she didn't know was that help was already on its way in the form of a determined cowboy whose tracking skills were legendary throughout the territory. Quentin made camp that evening in a sheltered arroyo, building only the smallest of fires to heat his coffee and cook a simple meal of bacon and beans. He had followed the Outlaws' trail all day, noting the direction they were taking and estimating their destination. If his suspicions were correct, they were heading for the Dragoon Mountains, a rugged range that provided numerous hiding places for men who wanted to disappear. As night fell, he extinguished his fire and spread his bedroll beneath a mesquite tree, his Winchester within easy reach. Sleep came fitfully, his mind filled with images of Katherine Foster in danger. By first light, he was back in the saddle, pushing midnight at a steady pace that ate up the miles without exhausting the horse. The tracks told him that the Outlaws' horses were tiring. One mount in particular, the one carrying double weight with Katherine and the outlaw leader, was showing signs of strain. Quentin's lips curved in a grim smile. Their desperation to distance themselves from Nogales might work to his advantage. By midday, the trail led into increasingly rugged terrain, the grasslands giving way to scrub and cactus as they approached the foothills of the Dragoons. Quentin dismounted occasionally to check the tracks, noting fresh droppings that indicated he was gaining on his quarry. Katherine spent an uncomfortable night bound to a tree at the Outlaws' camp. They had given her water and a piece of hardtack but otherwise ignored her, except for Becker, whose leering glances made her skin crawl. Cole had finally ordered him to take first watch and move away from the camp, much to her relief. By the following afternoon, they had reached their destination, an abandoned mining camp nestled high in the Dragoon Mountains. A dilapidated cabin and several collapsed mine entrances were visible, along with the rusted remains of mining equipment. "Home, sweet home," Cole announced, dragging Katherine from the horse and pushing her toward the cabin. At least for the next few days, until your daddy comes through with our money. The cabin's interior was dusty and sparse, containing only a rickety table, a couple of chairs, and a rusted iron stove. A moth-eaten blanket lay in one corner. "That's your bed," Cole told her, cutting the bindings on her wrists only to secure one of them to a heavy iron ring embedded in the wall, likely once used to restrain pack animals. "Rattle, you stay here and watch her while Becker and I go to send our ransom message." The young outlaw nodded nervously, taking a seat at the table and keeping his pistol trained in Catherine's general direction. Once the other two had departed, he fidgeted uncomfortably under her steady gaze. "You don't have to do this," she said after a long silence. "You're young." "You could still make a different choice," Rattle laughed bitterly. "Ain't no choices for me, miss. I'm wanted in 3 territories already. Cole and Becker, they're the only ones who'd ride with me now." "My father has connections," Katherine persisted. "He could help you if you helped me." "And get a bullet in my back from Cole or Becker," Rattle shook his head. "No thank you, miss. You just sit quiet and pray your daddy pays up quick." Katherine subsided, realizing she would get nowhere with the young outlaw, but as she studied her surroundings, she began to formulate a plan. The iron ring securing her was old and rusted, attached to a wooden beam that showed signs of rot. With enough time and effort, she might be able to work it loose. That evening, Cole and Becker returned, reporting that they had sent a messenger to Nogales with their ransom demand. 3 days, Cole told Katherine as he threw a bundle of dried beef and more hardtack onto the table. "That's how long your daddy has to deliver the money to the drop point. After that, well, he left the threat unspoken." Quentin reached the abandoned mining camp as the sun was setting on the second day of his pursuit. He approached with caution, leaving Midnight tethered a safe distance away and proceeding on foot through the scrub and scattered pine trees that surrounded the settlement. Through his field glasses, he observed the cabin and the 3 men taking turns standing watch outside. He spotted Katherine briefly when she was allowed outside under guard to relieve herself, and the sight of her still defiant despite her circumstances brought a tight smile to his face. Settling into a hidden position with a good view of the camp, Quentin began to plan his approach. 3 against 1 were poor odds, but the element of surprise would be on his side. He would wait for night to fall completely before making his move. Katherine had been working on loosening the iron ring whenever she was alone or when her guard seemed distracted. Her fingers were raw and bleeding from the effort, but she could feel the mounting give in the old wood. If she could free herself, she would need to find a weapon and wait for the right moment to escape. As darkness settled over the mountains, Cole and Becker sat outside the cabin playing cards by lantern light, while Rattle took his turn guarding Katherine inside. The young outlaw was clearly bored, cleaning his pistol repeatedly and occasionally glancing at her with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. "Why'd a fancy lady like you even stay in a place like Nogales?" he asked suddenly. "Thought all you rich folks preferred San Francisco or Denver." Katherine considered ignoring him but decided engaging might be to her advantage. "It's my home," she said simply. "My father built something there. Besides, I prefer open spaces to crowded cities." Rattle seemed to consider this. "Never been to a real city myself." "Always figured they must be something special though, with all them fancy buildings and such." "They have their charms," Katherine admitted, "but also their dangers. Not so different from out here, really." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. A single gunshot rang out, followed by a heavy thud and Becker's startled cry. Rattle jumped to his feet, pistol raised. "Stay put," he ordered Katherine, backing toward the door. The moment he turned away, Katherine gave one final desperate tug on the iron ring. With a splintering crack, it pulled free from the rotting wood. She immediately searched the cabin for a weapon, finding only a rusted mining pick leaning against the wall. Outside, another shot echoed through the night, followed by the sound of a struggle. Katherine gripped the pick tightly, positioning herself beside the door. When it burst open, she was ready to swing only to stop herself at the last second as she recognized the tall figure silhouetted against the night sky. "Mr. Hayes," she gasped in disbelief. Quentin Hayes stepped into the cabin, his revolver trained on Rattle, who lay unconscious at his feet. "Miss Foster," he said with a slight nod, as if they were meeting on the streets of Nogales rather than in an outlaw hideout. "Are you hurt?" "No, I—" She began, then swayed slightly as relief flooded through her. Quentin was at her side in an instant, his strong arm steadying her. "Cole and Becker?" she asked, glancing toward the door. "Becker's down." "Cole got away, but he won't get far on foot," Quentin answered, his eyes quickly assessing her condition. "We need to move now before he circles back with reinforcements." Katherine nodded, forcing strength back into her limbs. "I can ride." Quentin's mouth quirked in what might have been admiration. "I never doubted it." He secured Rattle with the outlaw's own belt, then led Katherine outside where Becker lay groaning, clutching a shoulder wound. "I tried not to kill them," Quentin explained quietly as he bound Becker as well. "Figured the law should have its say." The ride back to Midnight's hiding place was tense, both of them alert for any sign of Cole's return. When they reached the horse, Quentin helped Katherine mount, then swung up behind her. "We'll head southeast," he said, keeping his voice low. "There's a line shack about 3 hours' ride from here where we can rest safely until morning." As they rode through the night, Katherine found herself acutely aware of Quentin's presence behind her, the solid strength of his chest against her back, the careful way he held the reins to avoid crowding her, the faint scent of leather and wilderness that seemed to cling to him. "Why did you come after me?" she asked finally, when they had put several miles between themselves and the mining camp. "Sheriff Mills told me you refused the reward my father offered." Quentin was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. "Some debts can't be paid with money," he said finally. "What debt could you possibly owe me or my family?" Katherine asked, genuinely puzzled. "If anything, my father treated you unfairly when you worked for us." Again that lengthy silence. Then, so quietly she almost didn't hear it over the sound of the horse's hooves. "It wasn't about debt. It was about you." The simple statement hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than 1,000 flowery declarations might have. Katherine felt her cheeks flush and was grateful for the darkness that hid her reaction. They reached the line shack shortly before midnight. It was a simple one-room structure used by cowboys working the range, but it offered shelter and relative safety. Quentin lit a small fire in the stone fireplace and set about preparing a meager meal from his saddlebags while Katherine washed her face and hands in water from his canteen. "Your wrists need tending," he observed, noticing the raw skin where the ropes had chafed her. Without waiting for her response, he retrieved a small tin of salve from his saddlebags and knelt before her, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he applied the medicine to her injuries. Katherine watched him work, struck by the care in his movements. "You're good at this," she commented. "Doctoring, I mean," Quentin's lips quirked in a half-smile. "When you spend enough time alone in the wilderness, you learn to take care of yourself. Hold still now." His fingers brushed against her pulse point, and Katherine felt her heart skip a beat. The sudden awareness between them was almost tangible, like electricity in the air before a storm. Quentin must have felt it too, for he cleared his throat and moved away, busying himself with their simple meal they ate in companionable silence, both exhausted from the long day. Quentin offered Katherine the shack's narrow cot while he spread his bedroll on the floor near the door. "You should get some rest," he told her. "We'll head back to Nogales at first light." Katherine nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the events of the past days. As she settled onto the cot, she watched Quentin check his weapons one final time before lying down, his tall form barely accommodated by the small floor space. "Thank you," she said softly into the darkness. "Not just for the rescue, but for coming yourself, for caring enough to try." In the dim light from the dying fire, she saw him turn his head toward her, his expression unreadable. "Get some sleep, Miss Foster. We've got a long ride ahead of us tomorrow." Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded Katherine for some time. Her mind kept returning to the moment in the cabin when she had recognized Quentin, the overwhelming relief she had felt at the sight of him. It wasn't just gratitude, she realized. There was something more, something that had perhaps been there since their conversation under the stars a year ago. She finally drifted off with the comforting knowledge that Quentin Hayes was keeping watch just a few feet away. Morning came all too soon, with Quentin already awake and preparing coffee when Katherine opened her eyes. He handed her a steaming cup without comment, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. "We should reach Nogales by nightfall if we push hard," he said, packing his few belongings efficiently. "Cole's likely rounded up some men and will be on our trail, so we can't afford to dawdle." Katherine nodded, gathering her own resolve for the journey ahead. Her dress was torn and dirty, her hair a tangled mess, but none of that mattered now. What mattered was getting home safely and perhaps understanding the man who had risked his life to save her. They set out as the sun crested the eastern mountains, Quentin setting a brisk pace that Midnight handled admirably despite carrying double. He kept them off the main trails, following game paths and dry creek beds that would make their trail harder to follow. Around midday, as they paused to rest the horse and drink from a small spring, Quentin suddenly tensed, his hand moving to his revolver. "Someone's following us," he said quietly, his eyes scanning the rocky slope behind them. "Been on our trail for at least an hour." Katherine felt fear climb her spine again. "Cole, maybe," Quentin helped her quickly back onto Midnight. "We need to find better ground to make a stand if it comes to that." They rode hard for the next hour, eventually reaching a rocky outcropping that offered both cover and a good view of the approach. Quentin helped Katherine dismount, then positioned her behind the largest of the boulders. "Stay down," he instructed, handing her his spare revolver. "Only shoot if they get past me. I'm not helpless," Katherine protested, checking the weapon with practiced ease that clearly surprised him. "My father insisted I learn to defend myself." A ghost of a smile touched Quentin's lips. "Somehow that doesn't surprise me," his expression sobered. "Still, I'd prefer you not have to use it." He took position behind another boulder, his Winchester resting across the rock as he watched their back trail. It wasn't long before 3 riders appeared, moving cautiously as they followed the signs of Midnight's passage. "Cole's in the lead," Quentin murmured. "Don't recognize the other 2? Katherine peered carefully around her boulder. She could make out Jeremiah Cole's lean figure on a fresh mount, accompanied by 2 rough-looking men who had the distinctive appearance of hired guns. "What's your plan?" she whispered. Quentin's jaw tightened. "Persuade them to look elsewhere for their fortune." Before Katherine could respond, he called out in a carrying voice. "That's far enough, Cole." The 3 riders instantly scattered, taking cover behind rocks and scrub as Cole shouted back, "Hayes, I know that's you. Hand over the girl and you can ride away." "Not going to happen," Quentin replied calmly, sighting down his rifle. "You've got 2 choices: ride away now or die trying to take her." A rifle shot cracked in response, the bullet whining off the rock just inches from Quentin's head. He returned fire with deliberate precision, and one of Cole's companions cried out, clutching his arm. "Next one won't be a warning," Quentin called. "I've got the high ground and better cover. Do the smart thing for once, Cole." There was a tense silence, broken only by the wounded man's muffled curses. Then Cole's voice again with an edge of desperation. $5,000, Hayes, we can split it. Foster will pay that much for his precious daughter." "She's not merchandise to be bartered, Cole." Quentin's voice had taken on a dangerous quietness that made Katherine shiver despite the heat. "Last chance. Ride away now." The standoff stretched for several more minutes, neither side willing to make a move. Then, with a sudden flurry of movement, Cole and his remaining unwounded companion opened fire, sending a hail of bullets toward Quentin's position while the 3rd man attempted to circle around the rocks. Quentin responded with calm, methodical shots, forcing Cole and his man back into cover. Katherine, meanwhile, spotted the flanking outlaw attempting to climb the slope to their right. Without hesitation, she sighted down her revolver and fired, the bullet kicking up dirt at the man's feet and stopping him in his tracks. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The outlaw dove behind a boulder, clearly surprised by the 2nd line of defense. Quentin gave her an approving nod before returning his attention to Cole. The firefight continued for several more minutes, a tense exchange of shots with neither side gaining a clear advantage. Then, unexpectedly, the sound of multiple horses approaching from the south drew everyone's attention. "Quentin Hayes," a familiar voice called. "This is Sheriff Mills from Nogales. Lower your weapons." Katherine felt a wave of relief wash over her. Reinforcements had arrived just in time. Cole and his men must have realized their disadvantage, for they made one desperate push, firing rapidly as they attempted to reach their horses. Quentin's rifle cracked twice, and the flanking outlaw went down with a cry of pain. Cole managed to reach his mount and swung up, spurring the animal into a gallop only to ride directly into the path of the approaching posse. Within minutes, it was over. Cole and his surviving companion were disarmed and in custody, while the wounded were being tended to by the posse's designated medic. Sheriff Mills approached Quentin and Katherine with a relieved expression. "When you didn't return, we figured something had gone wrong," he explained. "Howard Foster financed this expedition himself." Katherine looked around in surprise. "My father is here." Mills nodded toward a distinguished figure dismounting from a fine chestnut gelding. Howard Foster, at 55, was still an imposing man with a full head of silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He strode quickly to his daughter, embracing her with uncharacteristic emotion. "Katherine, thank God you're safe." He held her at arm's length, examining her for injuries. "When Hayes didn't bring you back yesterday, I feared the worst." "Mr. Hayes saved my life, father," Katherine said firmly, stepping back to include Quentin in the conversation. "He tracked the outlaws alone and rescued me at great personal risk." Howard Foster turned to Quentin, extending his hand with obvious reluctance. "It seems I owe you a debt of gratitude, Hayes, and of course the reward money as promised." Quentin shook the offered hand briefly. "Keep your money, Mr. Foster. I didn't do it for payment." Foster's eyebrows rose. "Nevertheless, a deal is a deal. $1,000 upon my daughter's safe return." I said no. Quentin's voice was quiet but firm. "Miss Foster's safety is not something to be bought or sold." An uncomfortable silence fell between the two men, broken only when Katherine stepped forward. "Father, I'm exhausted and filthy. Could we please continue this conversation in Nogales?" Foster reluctantly nodded, offering Katherine his horse for the ride back. She hesitated, glancing at Quentin. "I believe I'll continue riding with Mr. Hayes if he's agreeable," she said with a quiet dignity that brooked no argument. "He's kept me safe this far." Quentin's expression revealed nothing, but he nodded once, extending his hand to help her back onto Midnight. As they rode toward Nogales, now surrounded by the safety of the posse, Katherine found herself both relieved by their rescue and oddly disappointed that her time alone with Quentin had come to an end. The return to Nogales brought a flurry of activity and attention that Katherine found exhausting after her ordeal. Her mother, Eleanor Foster, fussed over her injuries and insisted on calling the town doctor to examine her, while Howard Foster presided over a constant stream of visitors offering congratulations on her safe return. Quentin Hayes disappeared almost immediately after delivering her to her family's grand home on the hill overlooking the town. When Katherine inquired after him the next morning, her father informed her curtly that Hayes had declined all offers of reward or recognition and had last been seen heading toward his small ranch outside of town. "Good riddance," Howard muttered. "The man always did have more pride than sense." Katherine bit back a sharp retort, unwilling to argue with her father so soon after their reunion. But as the days passed and life returned to its normal rhythms, she found herself thinking often of Quentin, his quiet strength, his unwavering determination, the gentle way he had tended her injuries in the lined shack. A week after her return, Katherine made her first solo venture back into town, ignoring her mother's protests that it was too soon for her to be out in public. She had a purpose in mind, one that wouldn't wait for propriety or parental approval. The general store on Main Street was her first stop, where she purchased supplies that raised the eyebrows of Mrs. Holloway, the shopkeeper's wife. Coffee, sugar, bacon, beans, and ammunition for a Winchester rifle. "Planning a camping trip, Miss Foster, Mrs. Holloway asked with barely concealed curiosity. "Something like that," Katherine replied with a polite smile, requesting that the goods be loaded into her buggy. Her next stop was the livery stable, where she spoke quietly with old Sam Wilson about directions to a certain small ranch on the eastern outskirts of town. Sam scratched his grizzled beard thoughtfully. Hayes keeps to himself out there, Miss Foster. Might not welcome visitors. Nevertheless, I intend to call on him, Katherine said firmly, to express my gratitude for his recent assistance. Sam's weathered face creased in a knowing smile. Reckon gratitude's as good a reason as any to ride out there. Take the east fork at Miller's Creek, then follow the trail past the old sycamore. Can't miss his place small cabin with a good-sized corral, about an hour's ride from town. Katherine thanked him and set off, her heart beating a little faster as she guided her buggy out of Nogales. The day was clear and warm, typical for early summer in the Arizona Territory. As she followed Sam's directions, she rehearsed what she might say to Quentin, how she might explain her unannounced visit without seeming forward or presumptuous. The small ranch came into view just as Sam had described it, a modest cabin with a sturdy corral where several horses grazed, including the black gelding Midnight. A thin spiral of smoke rose from the chimney, indicating that someone was home. Katherine took a deep breath and steered her buggy toward the cabin. Quentin must have heard her approach, for he emerged from the cabin before she had even drawn to a complete stop, his expression shifting from wariness to surprise when he recognized his visitor. "Miss Foster," he said, stepping forward to help her down from the buggy. "Is everything all right?" Katherine accepted his assistance, acutely aware of his strong hands at her waist as he lifted her to the ground. "Everything's fine, Mr. Hayes. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I wanted to thank you properly for what you did." Quentin's eyes narrowed slightly. "You already thanked me, as did your father. There's no need for further acknowledgement." "I disagree." Katherine gestured toward the supplies in her buggy. "I've brought some provisions as a small token of my appreciation, and—" She hesitated, then pressed on, "and I hoped we might talk." For a moment she thought he might refuse, then his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I suppose I could offer you some coffee at least. It would be poor hospitality to turn you away after you've come all this way." He helped her unload the supplies, carrying them into the cabin while Katherine took in her surroundings. The interior was surprisingly neat and comfortable for a bachelor's dwelling, a solid table with 2 chairs, a small cook stove, bookshelves filled with well-worn volumes, and a narrow bed tucked into one corner. A rifle rack and a desk covered with maps completed the furnishings. "You read," she observed, running her fingers along the book spines. "Melville, Thoreau, Cooper, and several volumes of poetry. When there's time," Quentin replied, busying himself with the coffee pot. "Not much else to do on winter evenings out here." Katherine smiled, remembering their conversation about books at the Founders' Day dance. "I recall you mentioned enjoying Thoreau." Quentin glanced at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes that she had remembered such a detail. He understood something about the need for solitude and self-reliance. "And loneliness?" Katherine asked quietly. Quentin turned back to the stove without answering. When the coffee was ready, he poured 2 cups and gestured for her to sit at the table. "Why are you here, Miss Foster?" he asked directly, taking the seat across from her. "The truth, if you please." Katherine met his gaze steadily. "Because I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since you brought me home, because there are things I want to understand about what happened between us during those days." "Nothing happened between us," Quentin said, his voice carefully neutral. "I did what any decent man would do." "That's not true," Katherine countered. "Most men would have accepted the reward, for one thing. Most men wouldn't have risked their lives against 3 armed outlaws for a woman they barely know." "I know you well enough," he muttered, staring into his coffee cup. "Do you?" She leaned forward slightly. "Because I'm beginning to think I don't know myself anymore. The woman I was before the kidnapping wouldn't have dared drive out here alone to see you. She wouldn't have questioned what her father told her about how the world works. She certainly wouldn't have admitted to thinking about a man who her family considers beneath their station." Quentin's head snapped up, his eyes meeting hers with sudden intensity. "Is that what this is about, some kind of rebellion against your father? Because if so, I want no part of it." "No," Katherine exclaimed, frustrated by his misunderstanding. This isn't about my father. It's about you and me, and whatever it is that's been between us since that night we talked under the stars. Don't tell me you haven't felt it too. A muscle worked in Quentin's jaw as he set down his coffee cup. What I feel doesn't matter, Miss Foster. We live in different worlds. Your father made that abundantly clear when he dismissed me from his employ. Tell me what happened, Katherine urged gently. I never knew why you left so suddenly. Quentin was silent for a long moment, then sighed. Your father caught me teaching you to shoot that day behind the barn. He said no daughter of his would be handling firearms like some common ranch hand, and that I had overstepped my bounds. When I suggested that a woman in these territories should know how to defend herself, he took it as insubordination. Katherine remembered that day well, the weight of the revolver in her hand, Quentin's steady voice guiding her aim, the exhilaration she'd felt when she hit the target. She had been furious when her father interrupted the lesson, but she had never known that the incident had cost Quentin his position. I'm sorry, she said softly. That was unfair of him, Quentin shrugged. It was his right as my employer. But it made me realize something important about the Fosters. They might live in the territory, but they don't truly understand it. Out here, a person's worth isn't measured by their name or their bank account, but by what they can do, how they face adversity. And you think I'm just like my father? Katherine asked, a hint of challenge in her voice. Quentin studied her face for a long moment. No, he said finally. I think you're caught between two worlds, the society world your parents want for you and something wilder, more authentic that calls to you. I saw it in your eyes that night at the dance, and I saw it again when you fought against those outlaws instead of cowering. His insight took her breath away. No one had ever understood her inner conflict so clearly, not even herself, until this moment. You're right, she admitted. I've always felt like I was playing a role, being the proper banker's daughter, while something inside me longed for more freedom, more reality. She met his gaze directly. You see me more clearly than anyone ever has, Quentin. That's why I'm here. The use of his first name seemed to break something loose between them. Quentin stood abruptly, moving to the cabin window to stare out at the landscape, his back to her. What do you want from me, Katherine? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. Because if it's just gratitude or curiosity, I can't. It's neither, she interrupted, rising to stand behind him. It's something I can't even name yet, but I know it's real, and I think you feel it too. Slowly, Quentin turned to face her. They stood so close now that Katherine could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his tall frame. This can only lead to heartache, he said softly, though he made no move to increase the distance between them. Your family would never accept me. Then it's fortunate I'm old enough to make my own decisions, Katherine replied, her heart pounding as she placed a hand lightly on his chest. I'm not asking for forever, Quentin. I'm asking for a chance to discover what this is between us. For one breathless moment, Katherine thought he might refuse her again. Then, with a sound that was half groan and half surrender, Quentin's hands came up to frame her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin as he lowered his mouth to hers. The kiss began tentatively, almost reverently, but quickly deepened as Katherine responded with all the pent-up emotion of the past weeks. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as her hands slid up to his shoulders, feeling the strength there that had carried her to safety. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Quentin rested his forehead against hers. You should go, he whispered, though his arms still held her close, before I forget all the reasons why this is impossible. I'm not leaving, Katherine replied firmly. Not until you agree to at least try. Come to dinner at my parents' home tomorrow evening. Let me introduce you properly, not as an employee or a rescuer, but as a man I respect and admire. Quentin pulled back slightly, searching her face. You're serious, completely. She smiled up at him. Wear your best shirt, 7 o'clock. He shook his head in disbelief, but a reluctant smile tugged at his lips. You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met. I prefer determined, Katherine corrected, rising on tiptoe to press another quick kiss to his lips before stepping back. Tomorrow at 7, don't be late. As she drove back to Nogales, Katherine knew she faced an uphill battle with her parents, particularly her father. but something had changed in her during those days of captivity and rescue a certainty about what she wanted, a willingness to fight for it that hadn't been there before. Quentin Hayes had saved more than just her life. He had awakened her to possibilities she had never dared to consider. The dinner invitation came as a complete surprise to Howard and Katherine Foster. Katherine announced it casually over breakfast, as if inviting a cowboy to dine at their table was the most natural thing in the world. "Absolutely not," Howard declared, setting down his coffee cup with enough force to slosh liquid onto the pristine tablecloth. "Hayes is a hired gun, a drifter, not the sort of person we entertain in this home. He saved my life, Father," Katherine reminded him calmly. "At the very least, we owe him the courtesy of a proper thank you." "We offered him money, which he refused," Howard countered. "Our obligation ends there." Katherine Foster, a slender woman who had never quite adapted to frontier life despite 15 years in the territory, looked anxiously between her husband and daughter. "Perhaps Katherine is right, Howard. The man did bring her back safely when no one else could." Howard scowled at this unexpected support from his usually acquiescent wife. "That doesn't make him suitable company for dinner." "And what would make him suitable?" Katherine asked, her voice taking on an edge. "Money, family connections." "Because from where I stand, courage, integrity, and intelligence seem like better qualifications for dinner company." "You're being ridiculous, Katherine," Howard snapped. "Hayes is an employee, former employee," Katherine corrected. "One you dismissed unjustly, as I recently learned." Howard's face flushed with anger. "You've been to see him, alone. Have you lost all sense of propriety?" "I've lost my patience for artificial distinctions," Katherine replied, rising from the table. "Mr. Hayes will be arriving at 7 this evening. I expect both of you to treat him with the respect he deserves, not just as my rescuer, but as a man of worth and character." She left the dining room before her father could respond, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She had never defied her parents so openly before, but the memory of Quentin's kiss gave her courage. Some things were worth fighting for, even if the battle seemed impossible to win. Throughout the day, Katherine prepared for the evening with meticulous care. She instructed the cook to prepare Quentin's favorite dishes, information she had gleaned during their journey back to Nogales, and personally arranged flowers from the garden for the table's centerpiece. She chose her dress with particular attention, selecting a deep green silk that complemented her eyes and was elegant without being ostentatious. By 6:30, everything was ready except her parents' attitudes. Howard had retreated to his study for most of the day, emerging only to inform Katherine coldly that he would attend dinner as requested, but would not pretend to approve of her behavior. Katherine was more conciliatory, promising to be polite to their guest while gently suggesting that Katherine was perhaps allowing gratitude to cloud her judgment. At precisely 7 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Katherine, who had been watching anxiously from the parlor window, hurried to answer it herself, ignoring the maid's startled expression at this breach of protocol. Quentin stood on the porch, looking uncomfortable but undeniably handsome in a clean black suit, his dark hair still damp from what must have been a thorough washing. He held his hat in his hands, turning it nervously as he waited. "You came," Katherine said, unable to keep the relief from her voice as she opened the door. "I said I would," he replied simply, his eyes taking in her appearance with obvious appreciation, "though I'm still not convinced this is a good idea." "It's the right idea," Katherine assured him, taking his arm and guiding him into the house. "Even if it might be a difficult evening." Howard and Katherine were waiting in the parlor, their expressions guarded as Katherine performed the introductions. Quentin shook Howard's hand firmly and bowed slightly to Katherine, his manners impeccable despite the tension in the room. "Thank you for inviting me into your home, Mr. and Mrs. Foster," he said, his deep voice steady and respectful. "You have a lovely place here." "Yes, well," Howard said stiffly. "Katherine was quite insistent. She feels we owe you a more personal expression of gratitude for your assistance." Quentin's eyes flicked briefly to Katherine before he responded. "No gratitude is necessary, sir." I only did what any man would do in the circumstances. But that's just it, Katherine interjected. Not any man could have done what you did. The sheriff himself said your tracking skills are unmatched in the territory. A brief, uncomfortable silence followed, broken when Alina suggested they move to the dining room. Dinner began with painful formality, the conversation limited to safe topics like the weather and local news. Katherine watched her parents and Quentin carefully, searching for any sign of warming between them. It came unexpectedly when Howard mentioned a problem with cattle rustlers affecting several ranches near the border. The territorial authorities seem unable or unwilling to address the issue, Howard complained. It's affecting banking business. Ranchers can't repay loans when their herds are being decimated. The problem is jurisdictional, Quentin offered, setting down his fork. The rustlers cross back and forth across the border, and neither American nor Mexican law enforcement can follow. Howard looked at him with surprise. You seem well informed on the matter. I worked with the Arizona Rangers for 2 years before coming to Nogales, Quentin explained. Border issues were our primary concern. The Rangers, Howard's eyebrows rose. I wasn't aware of that part of your background. Katherine hadn't known either, and she listened with growing interest as Quentin described his time with the elite law enforcement unit that had been formed specifically to combat border crime. Why did you leave them to become a ranch foreman? Howard asked, his tone suggesting he found the career change puzzling. Quentin's expression grew more reserved. I lost my partner during an ambush near Bisbee. After that, I needed some time away from that life. The simple statement, delivered without embellishment, seemed to affect Howard. He nodded slowly, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its coldness. I understand. Loss changes a man's perspective. From that point, the conversation flowed more easily. Howard and Quentin discovered a shared interest in territorial politics, while Alina was impressed by Quentin's knowledge of literature when Katherine deliberately steered the conversation toward books. By the time dessert was served, Katherine could see that her parents were reluctantly reassessing their guest. He might not have the social pedigree they valued, but his intelligence, experience, and quiet dignity were impossible to dismiss. After dinner, Howard surprised everyone by inviting Quentin to join him for brandy in his study, a privilege normally reserved for his closest business associates. Katherine exchanged a hopeful glance with her mother, who gave a small, bewildered smile in return. Your Mr. Hayes is more educated than I expected, Alina admitted as they settled in the parlor to wait for the men. Though I still think you're being hasty, Katherine. Gratitude is not a sound basis for whatever it is you're contemplating. It's not gratitude, Mother, Katherine said softly. It's something much deeper, something that was there even before the kidnapping, though I might not have had the courage to acknowledge it then. Alina studied her daughter's face carefully. You've changed, she observed, since your ordeal. Katherine nodded. I have. I've realized that life is too precious and too uncertain to waste living by other people's expectations. I admire Quentin Hayes not because he rescued me, but because of who he is, his principles, his courage, his way of seeing the world and my place in it. And your place is with him, a man with no fortune, no position. Alina sounded genuinely puzzled rather than disapproving. I don't know yet, Katherine admitted, but I want the chance to find out. Can you understand that, Mother? Alina sighed, reaching out to pat her daughter's hand. I understand wanting something that others say you shouldn't have. I wasn't always the proper banker's wife, you know. A hint of mischief sparkled in her eyes. Your father had to work very hard to convince my parents that a frontier banker was a suitable match for a Boston debutante. Katherine stared at her mother in surprise. This was a side of Alina Foster she had never glimpsed before. Are you saying you support my friendship with Quentin? I'm saying, Alina replied carefully, that I support your right to make your own choices, even if they're not the ones I would make. You're 23 years old, Katherine. At your age, I was already married with a child on the way. She squeezed Katherine's hand. Just promise me you'll be careful with your heart. The world is not always kind to those who defy convention. Before Katherine could respond, Howard and Quentin returned from the study. To her amazement, they appeared to be continuing an animated conversation about water rights in the territory. Hayes has some interesting perspectives on the legal aspects of riparian access, Howard told his wife, in the tone he used when he had discovered something unexpectedly valuable. Apparently, he studied law for a time before coming west. Quentin looked slightly embarrassed by this revelation. Only for a year, sir. Family circumstances prevented me from completing my education. Nevertheless, a legal mind is evident in your thinking, Howard said, with what Katherine recognized as genuine respect. The evening concluded far more amicably than Katherine had dared to hope. When Quentin prepared to leave, Howard shook his hand with reasonable cordiality, and Alina actually invited him to call again sometime, an invitation that clearly surprised all parties, including Alina herself. Katherine walked Quentin to the door, stepping outside with him onto the porch where they could speak privately. "That went better than expected," she said, unable to keep the pleasure from her voice. "I think you impressed them." Quentin looked skeptical. "Your father was civil, which is more than I anticipated. But don't mistake politeness for acceptance, Katherine. Men like Howard Foster don't change their fundamental views overnight." "Maybe not," she conceded, "but it's a beginning." She moved closer to him, emboldened by the shadows that concealed them from any watching eyes. "When can I see you again?" Quentin hesitated, his sense of propriety warring with his obvious desire to be with her. "There's a town social on Saturday," he said finally. "Would you consider attending with me?" Publicly, Katherine's heart leapt at the invitation. A public appearance together would make a clear statement about their relationship, or at least, about their intention to explore the possibility of one. "I'd be honored," she said, reaching up to straighten his collar in a gesture that was both innocent and intimate. "Shall you call for me at 7? 7 it is." He caught her hand as she lowered it, pressing a kiss to her palm that sent shivers up her arm. "Good night, Katherine." "Good night, Quentin," she whispered, watching as he walked to his horse and rode away into the darkness. News of Katherine Foster's intention to attend the town social with Quentin Hayes spread through Nogales with the speed and intensity of a wildfire. By Saturday morning, it seemed everyone in town had an opinion on the matter, from the ladies of the Ladies' Aid Society who whispered behind their fans about poor Howard Foster's disappointment, to the cowboys and miners who slapped Quentin on the back when they saw him in town, congratulating him on roping the prettiest filly in the territory. Katherine was aware of the gossip, but determined not to let it affect her. When Quentin arrived at the Foster home promptly at 7 that evening, she was waiting, dressed in a blue gown that was fashionable without being too formal for a town social. Her father had retreated to his study, unwilling to witness her departure, but Alina stood in the hall to wish them a pleasant evening. "You look beautiful, dear," she told Katherine, then surprised both of them by adding, "And Mr. Hayes, you're quite handsome yourself this evening." Quentin, who had indeed made an effort with his appearance, wearing a new shirt and his best vest, thanked her with genuine warmth. "I appreciate your kindness, Mrs. Foster, and your trust in allowing me to escort your daughter." Alina's smile was tinged with something like sadness. "Katherine has always had excellent judgment of character. I'm learning to trust that more than social conventions." She shooed them toward the door. "Now go, enjoy yourselves, and don't worry about the hour. Katherine has her own key." The town hall had been transformed for the social, with lanterns strung from the rafters and wildflowers arranged on every table. A local string quartet provided music, and a long refreshment table offered punch and an array of homemade cakes and cookies. Katherine felt the stares and whispers as they entered, but Quentin's steady presence beside her gave her courage. He led her directly to the dance floor, taking her in his arms with a confidence that surprised her. "You dance very well," she commented as they moved smoothly through a waltz. "Another hidden talent," Quentin's lips quirked in a half-smile. "My mother insisted on lessons, said no son of hers would embarrass a lady on a dance floor no matter what else life might bring." "She sounds like a remarkable woman," Katherine said. "Will I meet her someday?" A shadow passed over Quentin's face. "She passed away 5 years ago, influenza." "I'm sorry," Katherine said softly. "What about the rest of your family?" "My father died when I was 16, no siblings." His tone was matter-of-fact without self-pity. What about you? Any brothers or sisters tucked away at Eastern schools? Katherine shook her head. I'm an only child. My mother had several miscarriages after I was born, which is part of why they're so protective of me. Quentin nodded in understanding. And why your kidnapping must have been especially devastating for them. Yes, Katherine admitted, I should probably be more patient with their concerns. She looked up at him with a smile, but patience has never been my strongest virtue. No, Quentin's eyes crinkled at the corners. I never would have guessed. The evening progressed pleasantly despite the curious glances and occasional whispered comments from other attendees. Sheriff Mills stopped by to chat, treating Quentin with the easy camaraderie of an equal, which did much to ease the social awkwardness. Several of Katherine's friends from the Ladies' Aid Society came to be introduced, their initial wariness giving way to genuine interest as they discovered Quentin's courteous manners and quiet charm. It was near the end of the evening, as Quentin was fetching them both cups of punch, that trouble finally arrived in the form of Barton Wells, son of the territory's wealthiest cattle baron and a man who had been pursuing Katherine with her father's encouragement for the past year. Katherine, he said, approaching her with a proprietary air that immediately set her teeth on edge, I've been looking for you all evening. I thought perhaps you were ill when I didn't see you at the start of the social. Good evening, Barton, she replied coolly. As you can see, I'm perfectly well. So I notice, he said, his gaze sweeping over her in a way that made her wish for a shawl, though I'm surprised to see you here with Hayes, isn't it? The ranch hand who happened to be in the right place at the right time during your unfortunate adventure. Katherine bristled at his dismissive tone. Mr. Hayes is a former Arizona Ranger who tracked me across 50 miles of wilderness and faced down 3 armed outlaws to bring me home safely. I'd hardly call that happening to be in the right place. Barton's smile didn't reach his eyes. Of course, very heroic, but surely your gratitude doesn't extend to publicly associating with the man. Think of your family's position, Katherine, your father's standing in the community. I am thinking of those things, Katherine replied, struggling to keep her voice level. And I've concluded that my father's standing will survive my choice of escort to a town social. Barton leaned closer, lowering his voice. People are talking, Katherine, saying things about you that no respectable woman would want said. For your own sake, you should. Is there a problem here? Quentin's deep voice interrupted as he returned with 2 cups of punch, his expression neutral but his eyes fixed intently on Barton. Barton straightened, his lips curling in a contemptuous smile. No problem at all, Hayes, just catching up with an old friend. Katherine and I have known each other for years, you see. Is that so? Quentin handed Katherine her punch, his fingers brushing hers in a gesture of reassurance. Miss Foster mentioned you, said you were interested in purchasing her father's bay mare. Something about needing a gentler mount after your last horse threw you during a cattle drive. Katherine nearly choked on her punch. She had said no such thing, and the implication that Barton wasn't man enough to handle his own horse was a calculated insult that couldn't be misinterpreted. Barton's face flushed with anger. You're mistaken, he said stiffly. My horsemanship is well known in the territory. My apologies, Quentin replied with feigned sincerity. I must have misunderstood. An uncomfortable silence fell between the 3 of them, broken only when the string quartet began a new dance. This is our dance, I believe, Quentin said to Katherine, setting aside their punch cups and offering his arm. Yes, I believe it is, she agreed readily, placing her hand on his sleeve and allowing him to lead her away from a fuming Barton Wells. That was unkind of you, she murmured as they took their positions for the dance, though her eyes sparkled with suppressed laughter. Barton is very proud of his riding skills. He was being unkind to you, Quentin replied, his voice serious despite the lightness of his steps as they moved through the figures of the dance, suggesting that your reputation would suffer for being seen with me. My reputation is my own concern, Katherine said firmly. Not Barton's, not my father's, and not even yours, Quentin Hayes. Remember that. Quentin's expression softened into a genuine smile. Yes, madam, I'll try to keep that in mind. The remainder of the evening passed without further incident, though Katherine noticed Barton Wells in deep conversation with several of the town's more prominent citizens, casting occasional dark glances in their direction. She decided not to mention it to Quentin, unwilling to spoil what had otherwise been a perfect evening. As they walked back to the Foster home under a canopy of stars, Quentin offered Katherine his arm, and she took it, enjoying the solid strength of him beside her in the cool night air. "Thank you for inviting me tonight," he said after they had walked for a while in companionable silence. "It meant a great deal to me." "Thank you for accepting," she replied, "and for standing up to Barton. He can be difficult," Quentin snorted softly. "He's a spoiled boy who's never had to work for anything in his life. Men like that mistake inheritance for achievement." "That's harsh," Katherine said, though she couldn't entirely disagree with his assessment. "Perhaps," Quentin conceded. "But I've met too many men like Wells born to privilege, convinced of their own superiority based on nothing more than the accident of their birth. They're dangerous because they believe they're entitled to whatever they want, regardless of who gets hurt in the process." Katherine considered this. "My father was born with nothing," she said after a moment. "He built his fortune through hard work and determination. Yet he and Barton's father are cut from the same cloth in many ways, believing that wealth and social position are the true measures of a person's worth." "Your father earned his place," Quentin said, surprising her with his defense of Howard Foster. "That makes a difference. He may place too much value on position, but at least he knows what it means to create something from nothing. Wells was born on third base and thinks he hit a triple." Katherine laughed at the baseball metaphor, then sobered as they approached her home. "My father won't make this easy for us," she said quietly. "Tonight was just the beginning of the resistance we'll face." Quentin stopped walking, turning to face her in the moonlight. "Are you having second thoughts?" "No," she said firmly. "But I want you to understand what you're getting into. The Fosters and the Welses control much of the commerce in this territory if they decide to make things difficult for you. I've faced worse than social disapproval and economic pressure," Quentin said, his voice steady. "The question is whether you're prepared for what might come being cut off from your family, ostracized by people who have known you all your life." Katherine looked up at him, her heart full of a certainty she couldn't quite explain. "Some things are worth the risk, Quentin. I believe this whatever is growing between us is one of them." He studied her face for a long moment, then slowly lowered his head to kiss her, his lips gentle against hers despite the passion she could sense simmering beneath his controlled exterior. It was a brief kiss, mindful of their public location, but it left Katherine breathless nonetheless. "Good night, Katherine," he said softly, stepping back. "I'll call on you tomorrow if I may." "I'll be waiting," she promised, reluctantly withdrawing her hand from his and making her way up the path to her front door. She turned once to see him still standing there, watching to ensure she entered safely before he continued on his way. As she had expected, her father was waiting in the parlor despite the late hour, a glass of bourbon in his hand and a thunderous expression on his face. "I've just had a most disturbing visit from George Wells," he said without preamble. "It seems his son witnessed quite a spectacle at the social tonight, my daughter openly flaunting her relationship with a common cowhand, making herself the subject of town gossip." Katherine removed her gloves deliberately, refusing to be rushed or intimidated. "Good evening to you too, Father. Yes, I had a lovely time, thank you for asking." Howard slammed his glass down on the side table. "Don't take that tone with me, young lady. Do you have any idea what you're doing to this family's reputation? To my business relationships? The Welses are our most important banking clients, and Barton has made his intentions toward you quite clear." "Yes, he's made his intentions clear, but I have never encouraged them," Katherine replied calmly. "And I'm sorry if my choice of escort this evening has caused you embarrassment, but I will not pretend to be something I'm not to please your business associates." Howard ran a hand through his silver hair in frustration. "This isn't about pretending, Katherine. It's about understanding your place in society, your responsibilities as a Foster. Hayes may be a decent enough man in his way, but he's not of our world." "Perhaps it's time our world expanded a little," Katherine suggested, meeting her father's gaze steadily. The territory is changing, Father. The old distinctions between East and West, between society and everyone else, they're breaking down. Can't you see that? Howard's expression hardened. What I see is my daughter throwing away every advantage I've worked to provide for her. What I see is willful defiance of my judgment and authority. I'm not a child, Father, Katherine said quietly. I'm a grown woman who has the right to choose her own path. I respect and love you, but I cannot live my life according to your plans for me. Not anymore. They stared at each other in tense silence, neither willing to back down. Finally, Howard spoke, his voice cold and formal. If you insist on pursuing this association with Hayes, you will do so without my blessing or support. I won't forbid you to see him. You're right that you're not a child, but neither will I pretend to approve. Katherine felt a pang of sorrow at the distance opening between them, but she nodded acceptance of his terms. I understand. Thank you for your honesty, at least. As she turned to leave the room, Howard added, And Katherine, Mr. Hayes is not welcome in this house again. If you wish to see him, you will need to do so elsewhere. Katherine paused at the doorway, her hand gripping the frame tightly. As you wish, Father. Good night. She climbed the stairs to her bedroom with a heavy heart, understanding now the full cost of the path she had chosen. Yet when she thought of Quentin, his integrity, his quiet strength, the way he saw her for who she truly was rather than who society expected her to be, she could not bring herself to regret her decision. The battle lines had been drawn, and Katherine Foster had made her choice. What remained to be seen was whether love could truly conquer the deeply entrenched social barriers that stood between her and the man who had captured her heart. The next weeks brought both joy and difficulty for Katherine and Quentin. True to his word, Howard Foster did not forbid his daughter from seeing Quentin, but he made his disapproval clear through chilly silence whenever she prepared to meet him. Eleanor, caught between husband and daughter, did her best to maintain peace in the household, often serving as messenger between the two stubborn Fosters. Katherine and Quentin met almost daily, sometimes for rides in the countryside surrounding Nogales, sometimes for quiet conversations in the town's small library, and occasionally for meals at the respectable but modest cafe near the town square. Each encounter deepened their connection and confirmed for Katherine that her feelings were far more than gratitude or rebellion. She discovered Quentin's dry sense of humor, his passionate interest in territorial politics, his detailed knowledge of the land and its history. He was teaching her to track and to shoot with greater accuracy, skills they practiced on their rides away from town. In turn, she shared with him her love of literature, her dreams of someday traveling to Europe, her frustrations with the limitations placed on women in their society. You should have been able to attend university, Quentin told her one afternoon as they sat beneath a cottonwood tree, sharing a picnic lunch after a long ride. Your mind is too sharp to be confined to social calls and charity committees. Katherine smiled, touched by his understanding. My father believes education is wasted on women who will only abandon it for marriage and motherhood. And what do you believe? Quentin asked, his eyes serious as he studied her face. I believe knowledge is never wasted, she replied thoughtfully. Even if I never use it professionally, learning expands the mind and soul. Besides, she added with a mischievous smile, who's to say a woman can't be both educated and a wife and mother? The roles aren't mutually exclusive. Quentin's expression softened. No, they're not. My mother was the most educated person I knew, read 3 languages, kept up with scientific journals. She taught me more than any schoolmaster ever did. She sounds wonderful, Katherine said, reaching out to touch his hand. I wish I could have known her. She would have liked you, Quentin said, turning his hand to capture hers. Strong-minded women always recognized each other. Their relationship progressed with a natural ease that surprised them both, as if they had known each other far longer than the few months of their acquaintance. Yet there were obstacles beyond Howard Foster's disapproval. Barton Wells and his father had begun a subtle campaign against Quentin, spreading rumors that questioned his character and motives. When Quentin arrived at the livery one morning to find his horse had been deliberately let loose during the night, he knew the battle was escalating. Sheriff Mills confirmed his suspicions. Wells's men, the lawman said bluntly as they tracked Midnight to a creek a mile outside town. Can't prove it, of course, but everyone knows. It's a warning, Quentin. The Welses don't take kindly to losing what they consider theirs. Katherine isn't anyone's property, Quentin replied, his jaw tight with anger. And I'm not backing down because some spoiled cattle baron's son feels threatened. Mills sighed, scratching his graying beard. Didn't figure you would, just watch your back. George Wells has a lot of influence in this territory and not all of it legal. The warning proved prophetic. 2 days later, Quentin received notice that his water rights were being challenged by a larger rancher whose property bordered a man known to be heavily indebted to Wells's bank. Without access to the creek that ran along his eastern boundary, Quentin's small ranch would be virtually worthless. When Katherine learned of these developments, she was furious. "This is my father's influence," she declared, pacing the small interior of Quentin's cabin where they had met to discuss the situation. "He may not be directly involved, but he's allowing the Welses to use the bank to pressure you." "Probably," Quentin agreed, watching her with a mixture of admiration and concern, "but getting angry won't solve our problem." "What will?" Katherine demanded, her green eyes flashing. "Giving up, pretending we don't care for each other," Quentin crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "Never that," he said firmly. "But we need to be smarter than they are. I've sent for some legal documents from Tucson records that prove my water rights predate the neighboring ranch's claim, and I've written to some of my former ranger colleagues for support." Katherine's expression softened as she realized he had already begun to fight back. "What can I do to help? Stand with me," he said simply. "That's all I ask. The rest we'll figure out together." She rose on tiptoe to kiss him, a gesture that had become increasingly natural between them. "Always," she promised against his lips. Their moment of connection was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Quentin moved to the window, his hand instinctively going to the revolver at his hip. "It's Sheriff Mills," he reported, relaxing slightly, "but he's riding hard." They met the sheriff at the door, immediately alarmed by his grave expression. "What is it?" Quentin asked. "What's happened?" Mills removed his hat, addressing Katherine directly. "It's your father, Miss Foster. There's been an accident, his carriage overturned on the road to Tucson." "He's alive, but badly injured. Your mother sent me to find you." Katherine felt the blood drain from her face. Despite their recent differences, the thought of her father seriously hurt filled her with dread. "How bad is it?" "Doctor's with him now," Mills replied. "That's all I know." "I've brought an extra horse for you." Katherine turned to Quentin, her expression torn between her need to be with her family and her reluctance to leave him amid the growing threats. "Go," he said immediately, already reaching for her shawl. "Your family needs you." "Come with me," she urged, gripping his arm. "Please, Quentin, I need your strength now." He hesitated, aware that his presence at the Foster home might cause additional stress at an already difficult time, but the pleading in Katherine's eyes overcame his reservations. "Of course," he said, reaching for his hat. "I'll be right beside you." The ride to town seemed interminable despite their rapid pace. Katherine's mind raced with terrible possibilities. Her father was not a young man, and a serious accident could be fatal at his age. The thought that their last real conversation had been an argument about Quentin filled her with regret. When they arrived at the Foster mansion, they found Dr. Henderson's buggy already outside. Eleanor met them in the foyer, her face pale with worry but composed. "Katherine, thank God," she said, embracing her daughter briefly before acknowledging Quentin with a nod. "Your father is stable for now. The doctor is with him." "What happened?" Katherine asked as she removed her riding gloves, her hands trembling slightly. Eleanor led them into the parlor where they could speak privately. He was on his way to Tucson for a banking conference. About 5 miles outside town, something spooked the horses. The carriage overturned in a ravine, if a passing traveler hadn't seen it happen. She trailed off, unable to complete the sentence. "How badly is he hurt?" Katherine pressed, needing to understand the full situation. "Several broken ribs, a badly fractured leg, and a head injury that has the doctor concerned," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "He's drifting in and out of consciousness." Katherine sank onto the settee, the reality of her father's condition hitting her fully. Quentin remained standing near the door, his presence supportive but unobtrusive. "Can I see him?" Katherine asked. "As soon as the doctor finishes," Alina promised. She glanced at Quentin, then back to her daughter. "Katherine, there's something else you should know. Barton Wells was here earlier. He claims to have important bank business to discuss with your father, documents that need signing immediately." Katherine frowned. "What kind of documents?" He wouldn't say specifically, only that they involve loans to several local ranchers, Alina said. "I told him Howard was in no condition to conduct business, but he was, insistent, said the matter couldn't wait." Quentin and Katherine exchanged a significant look. Given the Wells' recent actions against Quentin, this sudden, urgent business seemed suspiciously convenient. "Mr. Hayes," Alina said suddenly, addressing Quentin directly for the first time since their arrival. "You studied law at one point, did you not? That's what Howard mentioned after your dinner with us." Quentin nodded, surprised that she remembered this detail. "Yes, madam, for a year at Harvard before family circumstances called me home." "Would you be familiar enough with banking documents to know if something irregular was being proposed?" Alina asked, her normally gentle voice taking on a determined edge. "Mother," Katherine exclaimed, stunned by the implication. "Are you suggesting the Wellses would take advantage of father's condition to push through questionable transactions?" Alina's mouth set in a firm line. "I'm suggesting that I've been married to a banker for 30 years, and I've learned to be suspicious when someone is overly eager to complete business while the principal party is incapacitated." Quentin's respect for Katherine Foster increased dramatically in that moment. "I'd need to see the documents to be certain," he said carefully, "but I have some familiarity with banking practices from my legal studies." "Good," Alina said decisively. "Because Barton said he would return this evening with the papers, and I have no intention of allowing Howard's name to be signed to anything without proper scrutiny." Before they could discuss the matter further, Dr. Henderson appeared in the doorway, his aging face grave but not despairing. "Mrs. Foster, your husband is asking for you and Katherine." Alina rose immediately. "And how is he, Doctor?" "Stable for now," Henderson replied. "The next 24 hours will be critical, especially regarding the head injury. He's lucid at the moment, which is a good sign, but he needs absolute rest and quiet." Katherine moved to follow her mother, then paused, glancing back at Quentin. He nodded encouragingly. "Go to your father, I'll be here if you need me." Howard Foster lay in his large 4-poster bed, his face alarmingly pale against the white pillows, a bandage wrapped around his head. His right leg was splinted and elevated, and Katherine could see the careful wrapping around his chest that indicated the doctor's treatment of his broken ribs. "Katherine," he said weakly as she approached the bed, his voice barely above a whisper, "you came." "Of course I came," she replied, taking his hand gently in hers. "You're my father, I love you no matter our disagreements." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Stubborn girl. Just like your old man." His eyes drifted to Alina, who had taken a position on the other side of the bed. "Alina, my dear, don't look so worried. Takes more than a carriage accident to finish me off." "Don't you dare make light of this, Howard Foster," Alina scolded, though she stroked his hair with tender care. "You gave us all a terrible fright." Howard's expression grew more serious. "Need to tell you both something about the accident." He paused, seemed to gather his strength. "Wasn't an accident. Someone fired a shot near the horses, deliberate." Katherine gasped, and Alina's hand flew to her mouth. "Howard, are you certain?" Alina asked. "It couldn't have been a hunter in the area." Howard shook his head slightly, wincing at the movement. "Saw someone on the ridge just before it happened, wearing a bandana over his face." His eyes found Katherine's. "Been having problems with the Wellses. George threatened me yesterday when I refused to call in loans to Hayes and some other small ranchers. Said I'd regret choosing that cowboy over his son's interests." Katherine felt cold dread settle in her stomach. "Are you saying George Wells might have been behind this?" "Saying it's a possibility," Howard replied, his voice growing weaker. "Be careful, both of you, don't trust them." His eyes began to drift closed. "Tired now, need to rest." "Sleep, father," Katherine said, squeezing his hand gently. "We'll be right here." As Howard drifted into sleep, Katherine and Alina exchanged worried glances. Do you think it's possible? Katherine whispered as they moved away from the bed. That the Welses would actually try to harm father over business disagreements. Eleanor's expression was troubled. Your father and George Wells have been rivals for years, both in business and in territorial politics. But this would be beyond anything I could have imagined. She straightened her shoulders with sudden resolve. We need to speak with Mr. Hayes about those documents Barton wants signed. If the Welses are willing to cause physical harm to gain advantage, who knows what might be in those papers. They returned to the parlor to find Quentin in conversation with Sheriff Mills, who had apparently returned after completing his duties in town. Both men stood as the women entered. "How is he?" Mills asked, his weathered face showing genuine concern. "Resting," Eleanor replied. "But he was conscious long enough to tell us something disturbing. He believes the accident was deliberately caused, that someone fired a shot to spook the horses." Mills's bushy eyebrows shot up. "That's a serious accusation. Did he see who it was?" "Only someone wearing a bandana on a ridge above the road," Katherine said, "but he mentioned that George Wells had threatened him just yesterday over some banking matters." The sheriff and Quentin exchanged significant looks. "I'd heard rumors of tension between them," Mills admitted. "Wells has been pushing for the bank to foreclose on several small ranchers whose water rights he covets. Your father was resistant." "Including my property," Quentin added grimly. "Though I didn't know Mr. Foster was opposing the pressure, I assumed he was part of it." "Howard may be stubborn and traditional in his views," Eleanor said with unexpected fire, "but he's a fair businessman. He wouldn't participate in schemes to drive honest ranchers off their land." Katherine felt a surge of pride in her father, mixed with guilt that she had so readily believed him complicit in the Welses' machinations against Quentin. "We need to be prepared for Barton's visit this evening," she said. "If father is right about the Welses' involvement in his accident, then these urgent banking documents are almost certainly part of whatever they're planning." Sheriff Mills rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "I can't arrest anyone based on suspicion alone, but I can certainly be present when young Wells arrives with his papers. Might make him think twice about trying anything underhanded. And I can review the documents," Quentin offered. "At least provide an informed opinion about whether they warrant Howard's immediate attention." Eleanor nodded gratefully. "Thank you both. I don't know what we would do without your assistance." As the afternoon wore on, Howard's condition remained stable, though he slept most of the time, rousing only briefly when the doctor returned to check on him. Katherine and Eleanor took turns sitting with him, while Quentin and the sheriff discussed strategy for the evening's encounter with Barton Wells. "If the Welses are behind the attack on Howard," Quentin said quietly when he and the sheriff were alone, "they're far more dangerous than we realized. Challenging water rights and spreading rumors is one thing, attempted murder is quite another." Mills nodded grimly. "George Wells has always been ruthless in business, but this would be a new level even for him. Problem is proving it. Without a witness who can identify the shooter, we've got nothing but Howard's suspicion to go on." "Maybe the documents Barton brings tonight will give us more to work with," Quentin suggested. "If they're trying to push something through while Howard is incapacitated, it might tell us what they're really after." The sheriff clapped Quentin on the shoulder. "Let's hope so. In the meantime, I'm going to put a deputy outside the house tonight just as a precaution." Katherine joined them as dusk was falling, looking tired but determined. "Barton just sent word that he'll be here at 8 o'clock, she reported. "Mother is resting for a little while before he arrives." Quentin studied her face with concern. "You should rest too, you've had a shock." She shook her head. "I'm fine, just worried about father." She hesitated, then added, "And about you, Quentin. If the Welses are willing to go this far, you might be in danger as well." "I can take care of myself," he assured her, though he was touched by her concern. "And I'm not about to let them intimidate me into giving up my land or you." Katherine's eyes softened at his words. Before she could respond, Eleanor appeared in the doorway, looking composed despite the strain of the day. "I've had a light supper prepared," she announced. "We should eat before Mr. Wells arrives." The meal was a subdued affair, with conversation focused on practical matters: Howard's care, the running of the household during his convalescence, and preparations for Barton's visit. Katherine noticed that her mother treated Quentin with increasing respect and warmth, a silver lining to the dark cloud of her father's accident. At precisely 8 o'clock, the doorbell rang. The maid showed Barton Wells into the parlor, where he found not just Eleanor Foster waiting for him, but Katherine, Quentin, and Sheriff Mills as well. His confident smile faltered visibly at the sight of this unexpected reception committee. "Mrs. Foster," he began, recovering quickly. "I'm so sorry to intrude during this difficult time, but these matters truly cannot wait." He glanced at the others with poorly disguised annoyance. "Perhaps we could speak privately. Bank business is confidential, after all." "Whatever you have to say can be said in front of my daughter and our friends," Eleanor replied coolly. "As you can imagine, I'm reluctant to make any decisions without proper advice while my husband is unable to speak for himself." Barton's smile tightened. "Of course I understand. But I assure you, these are routine documents that Howard would want executed immediately. Several loans coming due, extensions to be granted or denied, the usual banking matters." "I'm not familiar with banking procedures," Eleanor said with deceptive mildness. "Perhaps you could explain the urgency to Mr. Hayes. He has some legal training and has kindly offered to review the documents for me." Barton's gaze snapped to Quentin, naked hostility flashing in his eyes before he mastered himself. "I don't see what a cowboy would know about banking law." "No offense, Hayes, but this is hardly your area of expertise." "None taken," Quentin replied evenly. "But as Mrs. Foster said, I do have some legal education. Harvard Law, briefly, enough to understand basic financial documents." Barton clutched his leather portfolio tighter. "This is highly irregular. These papers contain sensitive information about bank clients." "Including me, I imagine," Quentin said, his voice hardening, "since your father has been trying to force foreclosure on my water rights." Sheriff Mills cleared his throat meaningfully. "Mr. Wells, why don't you just show us what you've brought? Save us all a lot of time and discussion." Trapped, Barton reluctantly opened his portfolio and spread several documents on the table. "These are standard loan renewal forms," he explained, pointing to the first set of papers. "And these are foreclosure notices for properties that have defaulted on their terms." Quentin examined each document carefully, his expression growing increasingly grim as he read. When he finished, he looked up at Eleanor. "Mrs. Foster, these papers would authorize the immediate foreclosure on 6 independent ranches, including mine, despite all being current on their payments. They cite a rarely used clause about market conditions that allows the bank to demand full payment at any time." "That's absurd," Katherine exclaimed. "Father would never agree to such a thing." Barton's face flushed with anger. "These properties represent a significant risk to the bank. My father and I are merely protecting Foster Banking's interests while Howard is incapacitated." "By forcing honest ranchers off their land?" Sheriff Mills asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Land that, coincidentally, your father has been trying to acquire for years. I don't have to justify sound banking practices to any of you," Barton snapped, reaching to gather his papers. "If Mrs. Foster is unwilling to act in her husband's stead, I'll speak with the bank's board of directors tomorrow." "You'll do no such thing," came a weak but determined voice from the doorway. Everyone turned to see Howard Foster standing there in his nightshirt, leaning heavily on his cane, his face pale with pain but his eyes clear and furious. "Howard," Eleanor exclaimed, hurrying to his side, "you should be in bed." "I heard voices," Howard explained, allowing his wife to support some of his weight. "Thought I should see what all the commotion was about." His gaze fixed on Barton. "Trying to steal my client's property while I'm laid up, Wells. Your father must be desperate indeed." Barton's expression shifted from shock to calculation. "Mr. Foster, you're clearly not well. These are complex matters that require a clear head." "My head is perfectly clear," Howard interrupted. "Clear enough to see a land grab disguised as banking procedure." He looked at Sheriff Mills. "Sheriff, I want it on record that I am rejecting all of these documents and their proposed actions. Furthermore, I want an investigation into the accident that nearly killed me yesterday." Mills nodded gravely. "Already working on it, Howard. Though without witnesses, it may be difficult to prove anything." "I may have a witness," Quentin said quietly, drawing everyone's attention. One of my hands mentioned seeing a rider matching the description Howard gave, heading away from the Tucson Road around the time of the accident. He's a Yaqui tracker who works for me part-time, good eyes and a better memory. If we showed him some suspects, he might be able to identify who he saw. Barton's face had gone pale. This is outrageous. You're actually accusing my family of attempted murder based on business disagreements. My father will have all of you sued for slander. No one has accused your father of anything specifically, Barton, Katherine pointed out, her voice steady. Your reaction is telling, though. Barton looked from face to face, realizing he was cornered. With a sudden movement, he snatched up his documents and made for the door. You'll regret this, he threatened as he departed. All of you. After he had gone, Howard sagged visibly, allowing Quentin and Mills to help him to a nearby chair. Thought that might happen, he admitted wearily. Been suspicious of the Wells' sudden interest in those particular properties for months. They all sit on the proposed route for the new railroad spur. Katherine exchanged a startled look with Quentin. Railroad spur? What railroad spur? It's not public knowledge yet, Howard explained, wincing as he adjusted his position. As a banker, I was privy to the negotiations. Southern Pacific is planning a new line that would connect Nogales directly to Tucson and points east, bypassing the current roundabout route. Land along that route will be worth 10 times its current value. And the Wells knew this, Quentin said, understanding daunting. They've been trying to acquire those properties before the news becomes public and prices soar. Howard nodded. Exactly. When they couldn't buy them outright, they pressured me to foreclose so they could pick them up at auction. When I refused, he gestured to his injured body. This happened. Eleanor moved to her husband's side, her face pale but resolute. Howard, we need to get you back to bed before you collapse. Sheriff Mills can continue this investigation tomorrow. Mills agreed. She's right, Howard, you need your rest. I'll bring my deputy by first thing in the morning to take your official statement, and we'll locate Quentin's hand to see if he can identify the rider. As Quentin and the sheriff prepared to leave, Katherine walked them to the door while her mother helped Howard back to his bedroom. I don't like leaving you and your parents unprotected, Quentin said in a low voice. If the Wells are desperate enough to arrange an accident for your father, they might try again. The deputy will be outside all night, Mills reminded him. And I'll have men watching the Wells property as well, though without evidence, I can't do more than that. Katherine touched Quentin's arm. We'll be careful, but you should be cautious too. You're as much a target as my father, perhaps more so. I always sleep with one eye open, Quentin assured her with a slight smile. Habit from my ranger days. His expression grew serious again. Katherine, what your father said about opposing the Wells on those foreclosures that changes things between him and me. I know, she said softly. He's not the adversary you thought he was. No, Quentin agreed. In fact, I owe him my ranch. He glanced toward the staircase where Howard and Eleanor had disappeared. When he's feeling better, I'd like to thank him properly. Katherine smiled, feeling a weight lift from her heart. I think he'd like that, and I think he might be starting to see you differently as well. Quentin touched her cheek briefly. Get some rest. I'll be back in the morning to check on all of you. After he and the sheriff had gone, Katherine stood for a moment in the empty foyer, processing the day's revelations. Her father was not the obstacle to her happiness with Quentin that she had believed. In fact, he had been protecting Quentin's interests all along, at great personal risk. The real threat came from the Wells, whose greed and ambition knew no bounds. As she climbed the stairs to look in on her father before retiring for the night, Katherine felt a new determination growing within her. The battle lines had indeed been drawn, but not between her father and Quentin as she had feared. Instead, it was the Fosters and Quentin Hayes united against the predatory schemes of the Wells family, and this time she was certain they would prevail. The next morning brought a flurry of activity to the Foster home. Sheriff Mills arrived early with his deputy to take Howard's formal statement about the shooting that had caused his carriage accident. Quentin followed shortly after, accompanied by Miguel Santana, the Yaqui tracker who worked on his ranch. Miguel was a quiet, dignified man of about 40, with keen dark eyes that missed nothing and the patient demeanor of one accustomed to reading subtle signs in nature. He listened carefully to Howard's description of the man he had glimpsed on the ridge. "I can show you where it happened," Miguel offered in lightly accented English. "Perhaps there are tracks still visible despite the time that has passed." Sheriff Mills nodded. "Worth a try." "Mr. Hayes, would you and Miguel ride out there with me and Deputy Clark? Mrs. Foster can provide the exact location." Eleanor, who had been listening from the doorway of Howard's room, stepped forward. "I'd like to come as well. Howard has described the spot to me in detail." Katherine immediately volunteered to join them, but her mother shook her head. "Someone should stay with your father, dear. The doctor will be returning this morning to check his progress." Though disappointed, Katherine couldn't argue with the logic. She watched from the front porch as the small party mounted their horses and rode out, Quentin giving her a reassuring nod as they departed. Howard was awake and alert when she returned to his room, his color better than the previous day though pain still lined his face. He patted the chair beside his bed. "Come sit with me, Katherine. We should talk while we have this time alone." Katherine settled beside him, taking his hand in hers. "How are you feeling today, Father?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of longhorns," he replied with a weak attempt at humor. "But my head is clearer, which is something." He studied her face for a moment. "You look tired, my girl. You shouldn't worry so much about your old father." "I'll always worry about you," she said softly, "especially when you're nearly killed because of business dealings." Howard sighed. "It wasn't just business that motivated George Wells, Katherine. It was you as well." "Me?" she asked, confused. "What do you mean?" "George Wells has wanted to merge our families for years. His money and influence with my banking connections," Howard explained. "Barton's pursuit of you has been part of that plan all along. When you showed interest in Hayes instead, it was a double blow to their pride and their ambitions." Katherine felt a chill run through her. "Are you saying they tried to kill you because I refused Barton's attentions?" "Not solely," Howard clarified, "but it likely added fuel to the fire. George Wells is a man who believes he can buy or take anything he wants. Being thwarted in business and family matters simultaneously would have enraged him." Katherine absorbed this disturbing information. "I had no idea." "I'm so sorry, Father." "Don't be," Howard said firmly. "You have the right to choose your own husband. I see that now, though it took nearly dying to knock some sense into my thick skull." He squeezed her hand. "This Hayes fellow, Quentin, he's a good man, isn't he?" The question took Katherine by surprise. "Yes," she said simply, "one of the best I've ever known." Howard nodded slowly. "I misjudged him. Let my prejudices about his background and occupation blind me to his character." He gave her a searching look. "You love him?" Katherine didn't hesitate. "Yes, I do." "And does he love you?" Katherine smiled, remembering the way Quentin looked at her, the tenderness in his touch, the risks he had taken for her safety. "He hasn't said the words yet, but yes, I believe he does." Howard closed his eyes briefly. "Then I was wrong to stand in your way. If this accident has taught me anything, it's that life is too short and too precious to waste on pride and social distinctions." He opened his eyes again, his expression solemn. "When Hayes returns, send him to me. I'd like to speak with him alone." Katherine felt a surge of hope. "Of course." "But what will you say to him?" A ghost of a smile touched Howard's lips. "That's between him and me, daughter, but don't worry, I don't intend to threaten or intimidate the man. Those days are behind us now." The search party returned in the early afternoon, their expressions grim but determined. Katherine met them in the foyer, immediately sensing that they had found something significant. "What is it?" she asked, looking from face to face. "Did you discover something at the accident site?" Sheriff Mills nodded, removing his hat. "Miguel found tracks, both horse and boot prints, in a sheltered area near the ridge where your father spotted the shooter. And this." He held up a small cloth bag. "It was partially buried, like someone tried to hide it in a hurry." "What is it?" Katherine asked, staring at the unremarkable pouch. "Tobacco," Quentin answered. "A particular blend that's imported from Virginia. Very expensive, very distinctive." Katherine's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "And who uses this tobacco?" "George Wells is known for it," Mills confirmed. "Has it shipped in special from back east. Claims it's the only decent smoke in the territory." Eleanor, who had been listening silently, stepped forward. Is it enough to arrest him, I mean, Mills sighed. It's circumstantial. A good lawyer would tear it apart in court. But it's enough for me to bring him in for questioning, especially combined with Howard's statement and Miguel's identification of the tracks. Miguel recognized the boot prints, Quentin explained to Katherine. Said they match a distinctive pair of boots he's seen George Wells wearing in town, custom made with an unusual pattern on the sole. So what happens now? Katherine asked. Now I pay a visit to the Wells ranch, Mills said grimly. With Deputy Clark and a warrant for George Wells to answer some questions about his whereabouts yesterday morning. I'm coming with you, Quentin stated, in a tone that brooked no argument. If Wells realizes he's cornered, there's no telling what he might do. You'll need backup. Mills considered this, then nodded. All right, but you follow my lead, understood? This needs to be done by the book if the charges are going to stick. As the men prepared to depart again, Katherine drew Quentin aside. Be careful, she urged. George Wells won't go quietly if he's guilty. I know, Quentin assured her, but neither will I let him continue to threaten you and your family. He hesitated, then added, Your father asked to speak with me when I return. Do you know what he wants? Katherine smiled. Something good, I think. We had a talk while you were gone. He's had a change of heart about several things, including us. Quentin's expression lightened at this news. That's unexpected. Nearly dying tends to adjust one's priorities, Katherine said softly. Promise me you'll come back safely so you can hear what he has to say. Quentin touched her face gently. I promise. The confrontation at the Wells ranch unfolded more peacefully than anyone had anticipated. George Wells, perhaps realizing that evidence was mounting against him, agreed to accompany Sheriff Mills to town for questioning without resistance. His smug confidence, however, suggested that he believed himself untouchable, a man with too much money and influence to face serious consequences for his actions. By the time Quentin returned to the Foster home, evening was falling. Katherine met him at the door, her face anxious until she saw his untroubled expression. Everything went smoothly, he reported as he removed his hat. Wells is in custody, at least temporarily. He's already sent for his lawyer from Tucson. Do you think the charges will hold? Katherine asked as she led him into the house. Hard to say. The evidence is strong but circumstantial. Much will depend on whether we can find additional witnesses or if someone in Wells's employ decides to talk. Quentin paused. Your father wanted to see me, Katherine nodded. He's been asking for you since you left. He's in the study now, insisted on getting out of bed despite the doctor's orders. She led Quentin to the study door, then surprised him by not following him in. This is between you and father, she explained with a small smile. I'll be in the parlor with Mother when you're done. Howard Foster sat in a comfortable armchair near the fireplace, his injured leg propped on a footstool, a blanket across his lap despite the warmth of the evening. He looked older and more vulnerable than Quentin had ever seen him, but his eyes were clear and alert as he gestured to the chair opposite his own. Hayes, come in, sit down. Thank you for your help today. Quentin took the offered seat, noting the fine quality of everything in the room, from the leather-bound books lining the walls to the crystal decanter of brandy on the side table. This was a world far removed from his simple cabin, a physical reminder of the gulf that separated him from Katherine's upbringing. Sheriff Mills did most of the work, he said modestly. I was just along to help. Howard waved this away impatiently. Katherine tells me you found evidence linking George Wells to the attack on me. Miguel did, actually. He's the best tracker I've ever known. Quentin leaned forward slightly. Mr. Foster, I should tell you that even with this evidence, prosecuting Wells won't be easy. Men like him rarely face consequences for their actions. I'm well aware of how the world works, Hayes, Howard replied dryly, but justice isn't why I wanted to speak with you. He shifted in his chair, wincing slightly at the movement. I owe you an apology, Quentin blinked in surprise. Sir. An apology, Howard repeated more firmly. For misjudging you, for dismissing you from my employ without proper cause, and for attempting to prevent your relationship with my daughter. Of all the things Quentin had expected from this conversation, an apology was the last. He struggled to find an appropriate response. That's very generous of you, Mr. Foster, but unnecessary. It is entirely necessary, Howard insisted. I've spent my life believing that a man's worth is measured by his bank account and his social connections. It took nearly dying to make me see how wrong I've been. He looked directly at Quentin. You saved my daughter's life at great personal risk. You've now helped protect my family from further harm. And most importantly, you've won Catherine's heart through your character and actions, not your position or wealth. Quentin felt a strange tightness in his chest at these words. I care for Katherine deeply, he said quietly, more than I've ever cared for anyone. I know, Howard nodded. I can see it in the way you look at her, the way you've protected her. He paused, then asked bluntly, What are your intentions toward my daughter, Hayes? The directness of the question was oddly refreshing after weeks of social maneuvering and unspoken tensions. Quentin answered with equal directness. I intend to ask her to marry me, sir, if she'll have me. Howard studied him for a long moment, then reached for the brandy decanter. I think this conversation calls for a drink, don't you? Doctor's orders be damned. He poured 2 generous measures, handing one to Quentin. To new beginnings, he proposed, raising his glass slightly. Quentin touched his glass to Howard's. To new beginnings. They drank in companionable silence for a moment before Howard spoke again. You should know that I've made some decisions during my convalescence. One concerns Catherine's future. I've set aside a considerable sum as her dowry, which will be hers to control independently upon her marriage. Quentin set his glass down carefully. Mr. Foster, I don't want Catherine's money. I can provide for her adequately on my own. Howard's eyebrows rose. Adequately, my daughter is accustomed to certain comforts, Hayes. I understand that, Quentin acknowledged. And I don't expect her to live like a cowboy's wife in a one-room cabin. I've been saving to build a proper house, and my ranch is beginning to show a profit. It's modest compared to your wealth, but it's honest and it's mine. A smile touched Howard's lips. Well said. But the money isn't a bribe or a condition, it's Catherine's birthright, and it will be hers regardless of whom she marries. He leaned forward slightly. The second decision I've made concerns your water rights dispute. As of this morning, I've instructed the bank to formally recognize and record your prior claim to the watershed on your eastern boundary. No one, not even the Welses, will be able to challenge it again. Quentin was momentarily speechless. This gesture represented not just financial security for his ranch, but a public acknowledgement of his legitimate standing in the community. Thank you, he said finally. That's incredibly generous. Howard waved away his thanks. It's not generosity, it's justice. Your claim was valid all along. I was simply too prejudiced to acknowledge it. He set his empty glass aside. There's one more thing, Hayes. Katherine told me you studied law before family circumstances called you home. What were those circumstances, if I may ask? Quentin hadn't spoken of this to anyone in years, but Howard's unexpected openness deserved honesty in return. My father died suddenly, leaving my mother with significant debts and my younger sister to raise. I came home to help settle the estate and support them. By the time the situation stabilized, my sister was married, and my mother insisted I pursue my own path rather than returning to school. And that path led you west, Howard noted. Quentin nodded. I had always been drawn to open spaces, to a life less constrained by social rules and expectations. The law interested me intellectually, but the practice of it, at least in Boston drawing rooms, felt stifling. Howard considered this. Have you ever thought of combining those interests? The territory has a desperate need for men with legal training who understand the realities of frontier life. The territorial courts are overrun with cases involving water rights, mining claims, land disputes, all requiring someone who knows both law and land. Quentin hadn't considered this possibility, but as Howard described it, he felt a stirring of interest. Are you suggesting I become a lawyer out here? I'm suggesting you consider where your particular talents might be best applied, Howard replied. A man with your background, experience, and intelligence could make a significant contribution to this territory's development and provide a very comfortable life for a wife and family in the process. Before Quentin could respond to this surprising endorsement of his potential, the study door opened and Katherine appeared, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, glancing between them anxiously. "But Mother and I were wondering if you two had settled your differences or come to blows." Howard chuckled, a sound Quentin had rarely heard from the stern banker. "Neither, daughter. We've been having a civilized discussion about the future Mr. Hayes's future, and yours as well, if I'm not mistaken." Katherine looked at Quentin questioningly. He rose from his chair, crossing to her side. "Your father has given me his blessing to court you properly," he explained, taking her hand in his, "and has made some very generous gestures regarding my ranch and potential career." Catherine's eyes widened. "Father, is this true?" Howard nodded, his expression softening as he regarded his daughter. "It is. I've been a fool, Katherine, but I hope not so much of a fool that I can't recognize what truly matters when it's right in front of me." He glanced meaningfully at their joined hands. "Your happiness matters. Hayes's character matters. The rest is just details." Tears welled in Catherine's eyes as she crossed to embrace her father carefully, mindful of his injuries. "Thank you," she whispered. "This means everything to me." "I know," Howard replied gruffly, patting her back awkwardly. "Now, if you two wouldn't mind, I find I'm rather tired. Perhaps you could help me back to my room and then, well, I imagine you have things to discuss." As Katherine helped her father to his bedroom, Quentin stood by the study window, watching the last light fade from the western sky. The events of the past weeks had transformed his life in ways he could never have anticipated when he first rode out of Nogales in pursuit of Catherine's kidnappers. He had found not just a woman to love, but a future he had never envisioned for himself, one that might combine his legal training with his frontier experience in a way that could make a real difference in the territory. And perhaps most surprisingly, he had found acceptance from a man he had considered an adversary, a recognition of his worth that went beyond social status or wealth. When Katherine returned to the study, closing the door quietly behind her, Quentin turned to face her with a new certainty in his heart. "Your father is a remarkable man," he said. "To change his mind so completely, to acknowledge his mistakes so openly, that takes rare courage." Katherine smiled. "He is remarkable, though I've only recently come to fully appreciate that. But I didn't come back here to talk about my father, Quentin. I want to know what you're thinking, what you're feeling after everything that's happened." Quentin crossed the room to her, taking both her hands in his. "I'm thinking that I've been given a second chance at a life I thought was closed to me, a chance to use all of my abilities, not just some of them, and I'm feeling." He paused, searching for words adequate to express the fullness in his heart. "I'm feeling that I want to share that life with you, Katherine, if you'll have me." Catherine's eyes shone in the lamplight. "Are you asking what I think you're asking, Quentin Hayes?" He smiled, suddenly certain of his path forward. "I don't have a ring yet, and this isn't how I planned to do this, but yes, Katherine Foster, I'm asking you to marry me, to build a life with me here in the territory, not as a rancher's wife necessarily, but as the partner of a man who loves you more than he ever thought possible." Catherine's answer was to throw her arms around his neck and kiss him with an abandon that would have scandalized proper society, but felt absolutely right in that moment of perfect understanding between them. "Yes," she whispered against his lips when they finally broke apart. "Yes, I will marry you, Quentin Hayes, rancher, lawyer, or whatever else you decide to become, as long as you remain the man I fell in love with." "That I can promise," he said, holding her close as the last light faded from the sky and a new future opened before them. In the months that followed, Nogales witnessed many changes. George Wells was indicted for the attack on Howard Foster, though his high-priced lawyers managed to reduce the charges to a lesser offense that resulted in a substantial fine rather than imprisonment. The scandal, however, destroyed his social standing and business influence in the territory. Barton Wells departed for San Francisco, reportedly to seek more cultured society, though everyone knew he was fleeing the family disgrace. Howard Foster recovered slowly but steadily from his injuries, regaining much of his former vigor if not his complete physical strength. The experience changed him profoundly. He became known for a more compassionate approach to banking, particularly regarding small ranchers and farmers struggling to establish themselves in the challenging frontier environment. Quentin Hayes, with Howard's encouragement and financial backing, began studying territorial law with Judge Williams in Nogales, preparing to take the bar examination the following year. He maintained his ranch, but hired a foreman to handle daily operations, focusing his own energies on his legal studies and his courtship of Katherine. The wedding of Quentin Hayes and Katherine Foster took place the following spring, a grand affair that united the social elite of Nogales with the working cowboys and miners who respected Quentin's frontier skills and integrity. Eleanor Foster, initially reluctant to accept her daughter's choice, had become one of Quentin's strongest advocates, particularly after witnessing his gentle care of Howard during the banker's recovery. After a honeymoon in San Francisco, the newlyweds returned to a surprise. A newly constructed house on Quentin's property, spacious and comfortable without being ostentatious. A wedding gift from Howard and Eleanor that acknowledged both Katherine's upbringing and the independent life she had chosen with Quentin. 5 years later, Quentin Hayes had established himself as one of the most respected attorneys in the Arizona Territory, specializing in water rights and land claims, advocating particularly for small ranchers and farmers against corporate interests. His combination of legal knowledge and practical frontier experience made him uniquely qualified to navigate the complex issues facing the developing territory. Katherine, meanwhile, had transformed their home into a cultural center for the region, hosting literary discussions and musical evenings that brought together diverse elements of frontier society. She had also established a small school on their property where local children, regardless of background or means, could receive an education previously available only to the wealthy or those in larger towns. Their family had grown to include 3 children: James, named after Quentin's father, Eleanor, after Katherine's mother, and Howard, a robust toddler who already showed signs of his father's height and his mother's determination. On the 10th anniversary of Katherine's kidnapping, the event that had brought them together, Quentin and Katherine sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. Their children played in the yard under the watchful eye of Maria, their housekeeper, while Midnight, now a venerable old horse, grazed peacefully in a nearby paddock. "It's strange to think how differently our lives might have turned out," Katherine mused, her hand finding Quentin's on the armrest between their chairs. "If those outlaws hadn't taken me that day, if you hadn't decided to come after me." "I like to think we would have found each other eventually," Quentin replied, his voice deep and thoughtful. "Some things are meant to be regardless of the path." Katherine smiled at him, seeing both the young cowboy who had rescued her at great personal risk and the respected man he had become in the years since. "Do you ever regret it, giving up the freedom of ranch life for all this?" She gestured toward their home, the responsibilities of his legal practice, the family they had created. Quentin considered the question seriously, as he did all things. "No," he said finally. "I thought freedom meant answering to no one, being bound by nothing. But I've learned that true freedom comes from choosing your bonds wisely, choosing to be connected to people and causes that matter." He squeezed her hand. "You taught me that, Katherine." As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared, they sat in companionable silence. 2 people who had defied convention and expectation to forge a life that honored both their individual strengths and their shared dreams. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, a haunting sound that echoed across the land. They both loved a land of challenge and promise, of hardship and beauty, a land where an outlaw's desperate act and a cowboy's determination had set in motion a love story as vast and enduring as the Wild West itself.